You've heard sermons, you've read the Bible, but have you ever opened the Qur'an and seen what it actually says about Jesus? The words I found inside left me speechless. For so long, I thought I already knew everything there was to know about Jesus. Churches, pastors, books, and endless discussions had painted a picture that felt complete. But when I opened the Qur'an for the very first time, I came across verses that I never expected. Words that honored Jesus in ways I had never heard before, truths that seemed hidden in plain sight. The Qur'an doesn't dismiss Jesus. It doesn't reject him. Instead, it speaks of him with deep respect, calling him by titles like Messiah, Word from God, and a sign for all nations. Imagine my shock when I discovered that the Qur'an not only acknowledges his miraculous birth, but also describes it in detail, showing how Mary was chosen above all women and how Jesus was born without a father, purely as a miracle from God. But what truly struck me was how the Qur'an redefined what I thought I knew. It didn't place Jesus as divine, nor as the Son of God, but as a prophet, a man chosen by God to guide people back to the truth of worshiping the one Creator. For years, I had been taught that Islam denied Jesus, but here I was, reading verses that gave him honor, miracles, and a mission straight from God. Even more surprising, the Qur'an offered clarity on the crucifixion, a subject that always carried confusion and debate. According to its words, Jesus was not crucified nor killed, but saved by God. That single revelation turned my understanding upside down. And then came the prophecy of his return, something I never knew Islam also taught. The Qur'an presents Jesus not just as a figure of the past, but as a sign of the future, a man who will come again with truth and justice. These weren't small details. These were life-changing truths hidden in the very book I never thought to read. Today, I want to share with you those hidden words about Jesus in the Qur'an, words that may shock you just as they shocked me. The Qur'an begins its description of Jesus with a miracle that sets him apart from the very beginning, his birth without a father. When I first read this, I was struck by how clearly and powerfully it was described. Mary is chosen by God, honored above all women, and given the responsibility of carrying a child through divine command alone. The Qur'an tells the story of her retreat into solitude, her fear, and then the comforting words that remind her this is not a burden, but a sign, a miracle meant for the world to witness. What amazed me was how directly the Qur'an tied Jesus' birth to God's creative power. It draws a comparison with Adam, created without parents at all. Just as God said, "Be," and Adam came into existence, he said, "Be," and Jesus came into existence in Mary's womb. This wasn't about nature or science. It was about the limitless ability of the Creator. The Qur'an emphasizes that this was not a human act, nor a biological coincidence, but a deliberate miracle to show God's authority over life itself. I had always thought Islam tried to minimize Jesus, but instead, it actually elevated his story with a perspective I had never considered. His birth wasn't downplayed, it was magnified, not as proof of his divinity, but as proof of God's majesty. To me, this made sense in a way I hadn't expected. If Adam could be created without a father or mother, then why couldn't Jesus be created without a father? The more I read, the more I realized this miracle wasn't just about history. It was a reminder that God is beyond limits, and that every part of Jesus' life was meant to direct people back to him, the one who made the impossible possible. When I came across how the Qur'an describes Jesus' true role, it was like a veil had been lifted from my understanding. For so long, I was taught to see him as more than human, placed on a pedestal of divinity that separated him from every other prophet. But in the Qur'an, I found a very different picture, not one of rejection, but of clarity. Jesus is described as a prophet, a messenger chosen by God, sent with guidance and truth, just like the prophets before him. He wasn't stripped of honor. Instead, he was given a role of incredible responsibility. The Qur'an consistently reminds its readers that every prophet's mission was the same, to call people to the worship of the one Creator, and Jesus was no exception. He spoke to his people, reminding them of the law, urging them to righteousness, and guiding them back to God. I realized that in this view, his greatness didn't come from being divine, but from being obedient. His words, his miracles, his very life were testimonies of God's will, not of his own independent power. What shocked me most was how much sense this made when compared to the confusion I often felt before. The idea of Jesus being both man and God never sat comfortably with me. But in the Qur'an, He was simply and profoundly a man chosen by God, just like Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad, a man with a divine mission, but not divine himself. This understanding didn't lessen my respect for him, it deepened it. Seeing Jesus as a servant of God gave me a new appreciation for his humility and dedication. It was a perspective that turned reverence into clarity, a truth I had never been told before. The Qur'an's description of Jesus' miracles completely changed the way I understood his life. I had always believed his miracles were proof of divinity, that they set him apart from all other human beings. But when I opened the Qur'an, I read something I had never heard before. Every miracle Jesus performed was by God's permission. That single phrase, by God's permission, appears again and again, making it clear that the source of his power was never himself, but always the Creator. The Qur'an mentions miracles that are both familiar and surprising. It speaks of him healing the blind and the leper, just as I had heard in the Bible. But then I came across something new: Jesus shaping a bird from clay, breathing into it, and by God's will, it came to life. This miracle isn't found in the Bible, and it stunned me. It was as if the Qur'an was uncovering details that had been hidden, reminding me that his every act was a sign from God, not a sign of his own divinity. The more I reflected on this, the more it began to make sense. If every prophet was sent with miracles suited to their people, Moses with the parting of the sea, Muhammad with the Qur'an itself, then Jesus' miracles were no different. They weren't meant to point to him as God, but to confirm his mission as a messenger of God. What struck me most was how the Qur'an gave balance. It didn't deny his miracles, nor exaggerate them. It gave them context. Jesus was a servant of God, chosen and supported with extraordinary signs, and that realization took nothing away from his greatness. Instead, it made me see him with even more awe, not as God, but as a man through whom God showed his limitless power. One of the most shocking discoveries I made in the Qur'an was its explanation of the crucifixion. For most of my life, I believed the crucifixion was the cornerstone of Jesus' story, his ultimate sacrifice, the moment that defined Christianity. But the Qur'an presented something I had never encountered before. It said that Jesus was not crucified nor killed. Instead, it revealed that it only appeared that way to people, while in reality, God raised him up and protected him from harm. At first, I couldn't process it. The crucifixion had always been presented to me as the undeniable truth. But when I thought about it, I remembered the questions I had buried deep inside. Why would God allow his prophet to be humiliated in such a way? Why would an all-powerful creator need such an event to forgive humanity? The Qur'an gave me an answer that resolved those doubts. It said God would never abandon his messenger to such a fate. Instead, Jesus was honored and saved, while those who thought they had defeated him were left in confusion. This perspective turned the entire story upside down for me. Instead of being about defeat and death, it became about protection and victory. Jesus was not a victim on a cross, he was a prophet shielded by God, lifted beyond the reach of his enemies. The Qur'an even emphasizes that people still argue about what happened, admitting that they follow nothing but conjecture. That hit me hard, because confusion over the crucifixion has divided people for centuries. The Qur'an's version didn't just rewrite history for me, it reshaped my faith. It made me see Jesus not as a symbol of suffering, but as a sign of God's power to protect, save, and honor those who truly serve him. What completely stunned me was learning that the Qur'an doesn't end Jesus' story in the past. It connects him to the future. According to Islam, Jesus is not finished with his mission. He was raised up by God, and one day he will return to earth before the end of time. This return is described not as the start of a new religion, but as the continuation and completion of his true purpose to confirm the truth, to defeat falsehood, and to bring justice. The idea that Jesus is still alive, protected by God, waiting for his appointed time, gave me chills. I had always thought of him as belonging to history, a figure of the past. But the Qur'an paints a different picture. Jesus is part of what is still to come. His return is a sign of the final hour, a reminder that the world's story is not complete without him. What struck me the most was how consistent this sounded. If Jesus had such a miraculous beginning, why wouldn't his end also be extraordinary? The Qur'an shows that God's plan for him was never about tragedy on a cross, but about victory in the end. He will return to restore truth, to stand against deception, and to remind humanity of the worship of one God. this teaching turned everything I thought I knew on its head. It wasn't about Jesus being rejected or minimized. It was about him being preserved for a greater role. The idea that he is still alive, that he will return with a divine mission, made me see him with even deeper respect. It showed me that Islam doesn't close his story. It keeps it alive, waiting for its most powerful chapter yet. As I close this journey, I can't help but reflect on how different my perspective on Jesus has become. For years, I thought I already knew his story, and I believed that Islam had nothing meaningful to say about him. But reading the Qur'an for myself revealed something completely unexpected. Words that honored him, protected him, and gave his life and mission a depth I had never seen before. The Qur'an showed me that Jesus was not rejected in Islam, but preserved in truth. His miraculous birth was described in detail, a reminder of God's limitless power. His role was clarified, not as divine but as a prophet, a messenger who called people to worship the one God. His miracles were honored, yet always attributed to God's permission, showing that his greatness lay in obedience, not self-made power. His so-called crucifixion was replaced with a story of protection and divine justice, reminding me that God never abandons his chosen ones. And finally, his return at the end of time proved that his mission is not finished. His story is still alive, waiting to be completed. These were not small details hidden in passing verses. They were powerful truths that challenge everything I had assumed. And the more I thought about them, the more I realized how much sense they made. Instead of confusion, the Qur'an offered clarity. Instead of contradictions, it gave a consistent and uplifting view of Jesus. Instead of lowering his status, it actually raised his honor by connecting him directly to God's will. I was left shocked not because Islam had taken away Jesus, but because it had preserved his true place, a prophet, a servant, a sign, and a man who still has a role to play in humanity's future. That realization shook me because it meant I had been missing an entire side of Jesus' story, one that had been there all along in the Qur'an. So if you've only ever heard about Jesus from one perspective, I invite you to explore what the Qur'an actually says. You may find, just like I did, that its hidden words will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew, and perhaps discovering a truth that feels both new and timeless at the same time.